I was talking not too long ago to a friend about Osceola, what he did in the war. So I wanted to put together this presentation for a long time. And so I finally did it, sat down last night and tonight and put together a little presentation. And if I can get the screen share here. Okay, this program is Where Did Osceola Go? If I can get, there we are. Okay. Oh, my head's right there. Okay, where was Osceola during the Second Seminole War? Um, at the time, the newspapers claimed that he was everywhere from the Everglades up into Georgia, Alabama. Well, let's go back in the records and actually look to see who he was with. So I went and looked back to all the sources covering about the 2 years that Osceola was in the war and see what places we have that we know he was there from eyewitness accounts, reports, pe- people who knew him and actually saw him. So here it is. Before the war started in summer 1835, and Osceola was known to be around Fort King, and he was there, with some of the negotiations with the non-removal or the force that wanted to stay in Florida. He was one of the strongest ones on that side. And it's believed that you'll see in the center of the map, I have circled Fort King, and just south of there was Osceola's village at the time, near where there's a mall in Ocala now. There, it's the site is not preserved. In the summer of 1835, there's an incident where some Seminoles got in a fight with settlers in Alachua County, and Osceola went to the Indian agent's office, and Wiley Thompson said he acted imprudent, so they locked him up in the stockade until the other Seminole leaders negotiated his release and promised that he remove his people from Florida. And so he agreed, or said he would agree to it, and they released him. Wiley Thompson thought that he had a change of heart, that bought him a nice rifle up in Savannah, and we'll hear about that in a bit, and figured he was going to be leaving Florida, but not so much. Right before the war started, one of the chiefs, Micanopy chief Charlie Emathla, he agrees to sell his cattle and go down to Tampa and immigrate. And Osceola assassinates him, kills him near his village of Wetumpka, which is in northern Marion County, or what's now Marion County today, just north of Fort King, 10 or 20 miles, I forget how far. And so Osceola carries out the execution according to the decree of the Seminole leadership. So following the death of Charlie Emathla, over the next few weeks in around the area of Alachua, Noonanville, Wetumpka, Micanopy, there's several raids and skirmishes between the Seminoles and the Florida militia, the burning of Gabriel Priest's plantation. We don't know if Osceola was involved in any of those skirmishes. There's very little information. It has to come from Florida militia and not the Army reports. The Army was not involved in those. So we don't have any much information, and we don't have any mention of Osceola involved in those attacks. But it's worth noting because it's in his area. So, hold on. Okay, in December 18th, 1835, there's a Seminoles attack a supply train of the Florida militia coming down from around Alachua Prairie, going down to Wakahuta, and then goes to Micanopy. And some people said it was by Payne's Prairie. I've always contended it was by Kanapaha Prairie, which is more in line with the roads of the time. and also Kanapa Prairie was considered part of Payne's Prairie at the time. Anyway, that's known as the Battle of Black Point. Osceola may have been involved. There's one source that says he could have uh, been the one leading the attack, but he's not mentioned by all those people involved, and there's several accounts of the battle. Then 10 days later, Osceola takes revenge on Wiley Thompson. So, he heads back south to Fort King and kills Wiley Thompson while he's coming home from supper at the sutler store. Of course, I've always wanted to use this image here. It's supposed to be the death of Thompson, but really there weren't any other officers present except Lieutenant Constantine Smythe, and he was killed at the same time. They were not inside a building. They were walking along the path back to Fort King. At the same day, the attack on Dade's command, and Dade's command was wiped out, and that was 40 miles to the south. Osceola was supposed to be there, but he was taking revenge on Thompson, using the rifle that Thompson gave him a few months before. Exactly 3 days later, we go from Fort King down to the Withlacoochee River. And here's a great painting by artist Jackson Walker of the Battle of Withlacoochee. It's called Withlacoochee Abyss. Osceola is definitely seen at the battle by several people who know him well. Captain John Graham is one of them. Osceola is seen rallying his men, encouraging his men, and wearing a soldier's greatcoat. Not sure where he got that. There's 2 or 3 instances where he could have gotten that a few days earlier. Maybe it was the coat of Lieutenant Constantine Smythe. Osceola is said to be injured in the hand on that battle. Then, a couple weeks later, there's a skirmish with the Florida militia and unnamed Seminoles or Miccosukee at Wetumpka, back near where Charlie Emathla was, in his town in northern Marion County. It's possible that Osceola was involved in this. But the very next day, Colonel Parrish takes his forces and burns Osceola's village nearby. You can see where I have it circled on the map is the area Wetumpka, and the green dot is Osceola's village. So we don't know if Osceola is there. The next month, we have General Gaines under siege at Camp Izard. The time they're at Camp Izard, about 10 days, I believe, surrounded by 1,500 Seminoles. I think it's about 250 men under General Gaines, waiting for supplies from General Clinch at Fort Drane. Finally, both sides decide to call an armistice and have a talk, and General Gaines agrees to talk to the Seminoles. He sends out Colonel Ethan Allen Hitchcock, who meets with Abraham, Jumper, and Osceola. So we know Osceola was there. Next, there's an interesting account credited by Osceola, but there's a little problem with this. This is about 6 weeks later at Volusia on the St. Johns River at Fort Barnwell. Burial party, that's a sergeant and a couple privates going out to bury a soldier outside the fort. They go over the hill. They're ambushed by Seminoles who kill them. And the person who wrote the account, W.W. Smith, I'll show that book him it. He claims that the warriors there are Indians under Osceola, and then he says, that looks like Osceola standing there far away in the trees. It's kind of sketchy if that was Osceola or not. He may just be crediting to Osceola because Smith was new to the territory. He really didn't know Osceola personally, but at the time, Osceola was claimed for a lot of battles and events. because if you're going to get beat and ambushed, you want to do it, have it done by the best. There, you want to be defeated by the Napoleon of the Indians, Osceola himself, because there's no way you could have won against him. And so that's kind of take the pressure off you to being called incompetent for being beaten by the Indians. He said, well, they just have the best guy doing it, so there's no way I could win against those odds. So it's kind of sketchy. Another thing is the Indians operating this area was Uchee Billy and Uchee Jack out of Spring Garden. So it's more likely it might have been them at the time. Next, we go back to our area around Marion, Alachua County, the skirmish at Fort Defiance, Lake Tuscaloosa on January 9th, 1836. It's a very bold and unorthodox tactic of fighting. The Seminoles fight at night. They don't back off. They almost surround the cannon and capture the cannon. And the soldiers just barely get out of that one alive. And the battle stretches around the shore of Lake Tuscaloosa. And it's pretty certain by accounts that Osceola was there. As some of the officers said they recognized him. And this is the area he was operating in. This area right now is in danger. They're going to build a Dollar General store in the town of Micanopy, right in the area where this was. Even though they don't need a Dollar General store there, I would love to see this battle site preserved because it's one of the few battles that we know Osceola was actually there. That would be really cool to preserve it. I don't know, maybe the people in Gainesville have something against Seminoles. I don't know. Then a few days later, 10 days later, soldiers go down to Fort Drane, 10 miles south. They're evacuating Fort Drane. As they're coming back, they're less than a mile from Micanopy. I think it's half a mile, quarter mile, Willaca Pond. They're ambushed by Seminoles. Colonel Pierce, I believe, and I'm not sure if it's him. Major Ashby is another of the officers involved. And it's a pretty tough skirmish. Everybody was involved, including the Teamsters are fighting. So that's a pretty significant skirmish that we think Osceola was involved in. And then almost a month later, the soldiers at Micanopy hear that the Indians have occupied the abandoned Fort Drane and are living in the fort. So Colonel Pierce, I guess he's Major Pierce at this point, this is before he got promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, maybe. He takes about 300 soldiers down in the middle of the night, and right before sunrise, he has a surprise attack on the Seminoles at Fort Drane. It's a running skirmish about a mile and a half into the hammock, or it covers that distance. The hammock's about a mile and a half long. And the Indians escape. Osceola escapes. A very significant battle. The army does not really make any significant gains other than chasing the Indians out of Fort Drane. So next, a month later, there's another battle at San Velasco Hammock, northwest of Gainesville. It's a beautiful state park. I have a picture of it here. No mention of who the Indians are involved. Colonel Warren of the Florida Militia, he would have most likely known Osceola. He does not mention Osceola, so we don't know if Osceola was involved. It's a possibility, but there's no mention of that. And then 2 months later, we have the Battle of Wahoo Swamp down near west of Bushnell, 8 miles from Dade Battlefield. The Battle of Wahoo Swamp, it's said that Osceola was there, but he was further down the line in an area the Seminoles were ready to fight, but they weren't engaged at that point. So he was at the battle. The battle line was a mile and a half long. It's just the part that Osceola was at was not engaged in the battle. That does not mean he was demoted. It means, for one thing, this area was mainly known as Chief Jumper's village in this area. So it's believed that Jumper's people might have been in the forefront, because if you're fighting uh, for your village, you better be out in front and defending the village and not leaving it to somebody else. So that's why I think maybe Osceola was maybe not at the side. Osceola did have a village. You see that uh, northwest of the Wahoo, you see that green dot. He did have a village in the Withlacoochee River area that the soldiers found a couple months earlier and burned. The village site was also visited later in the war by Lieutenant Henry Prince. So that was another one of Osceola's village. Now, this painting by Jackson Walker, Tribal Duel, Osceola's cousin supposedly was his cousin that married David Moniac, a Creek Indian, first Native American that attended West Point. And so it's believed the Seminoles may have known David Moniac, and that's maybe why they targeted him. He was charging in front and killed in the charge, killed at this battle, and there's a tombstone for him at the Veterans National Cemetery in Bushnell, although he's not actually buried there. There is a monument. And so this was the last battle Osceola was involved in that we know about. So we cover a year's time just now, and those were all the battles we know Osceola was in. There was not too many other battles in the next year, because there's the Fort Dade capitulation, or before that, soldiers are looking for Osceola around Fort Drane, about a couple weeks after the Battle of Wahoo. They supposedly find his village and burn it, but they don't find Osceola. So the soldiers fail against going after Osceola. But there's no battle at this point. And the Fort Dade capitulation, early March 1837, some of the Seminole leaders at Fort Dade, Abraham, Jumper, Micanopy, agreed to capitulate and eventually go down to Fort Brooke and surrender. Osceola is not involved in that talk. It said that he opposed it at that point. Not too long later, he shows up at Fort Mellon and plays ball game with his warriors in the creeks. Osceola even sleeps in the tent with Colonel Harney at one point, giving the appearance that he's also agreeing to the capitulation and that he's going to surrender. But eventually the Seminoles at around Fort Mellon, they disappear soon after. The next time Osceola is seen is down on June 2nd, 1837. Before daylight, Sam Jones and Osceola and some of their Seminoles that are against removal, they show up at the Seminole camp, and before daylight, all the Seminoles have fled. Here's a famous statue at Treetops Park, and also at the Otafakee Museum of Sam Jones leading the women and children away to safety. So that's something he did a number of times in the war. So Osceola is said to be down here in a special mission, showing that he's definitely subordinate to Sam Jones and following the Miccosukee anti-removal force. The next thing we know of Osceola is in October, he agrees to come to a talk at Fort Peyton, where he's captured. General Hernandez is leading the talk under orders of General Jessup, and Osceola is surrounded and captured. pretty famous story. You all know about that. So no reason to talk much more about that. But that was pretty much the end of the line. He was taken as prisoner to St. Augustine. And 2 months later, on around December 31st, he was put on a ship, and 200 Seminoles are taken up to Fort Moultrie, South Carolina, where Osceola dies 1 month later, around January 30th, 1838. So, in a year's time, most of Osceola's skirmishes are centered around what's today Marion, Alachua County. Pretty much at the center of that is Fort King. So that is the area of operation that Osceola is involved in. Now, we can tell a few things from his operations and the battles he is in. One is that the Seminoles, uh, they were fighting, of course, a desperate war of attrition that nobody was going to help them. Uh, the soldiers, if they need more men or more supplies, they could get that from New Orleans or Charleston or New York. There was no end to the government fueling the war. The Seminoles had no such resources. They had to get all the food that they could either grow or capture, and that was it. Nobody was coming down to help them. There were not 5,000 Indians from out west coming to the Seminoles, so that was it. So they had to be very careful on the food that they used. They had to store all the food, the gunpowder, and they were very prudent. They had been doing this months before the war started, and that's from the accounts from Jumper and Osceola themselves, who said that they had the guns and the powder and the food. And during much of the war, that's also seen once again that the Seminoles are somehow usually well supplied of lead and powder. But you don't want to waste it. You want to be very careful with your resources. So a lot of these battles, Osceola has spread out his battles maybe every month, every 3 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. He's not having a battle every day and exhausting his supplies and his men. Another thing, if you're fighting and have to move stealthily, you have to figure about food and resources. Logistics is always a problem for the Seminoles as much as the soldiers. So that's a consideration. And it seemed that Osceola was very aware of this and paced himself very wisely on that. So maybe we can see the strategy that he was doing, operating out of a specific area and being very frugal on his supplies. So I think that's it for now. Uh, so I wanted to cover what we know of Osceola involved in the war. The press made him up to be a hero, but you can see that there's only about half a dozen battles that we actually know he was involved in. Um, so his fame was probably more to being against removal and resisting, telling his people to stay in Florida, and that's what he did. But I hope showing this can actually tell you about his fighting, uh, his strategy, and his skills, and actually, I think says a lot on how he fought. Okay, so hope you enjoyed the presentation.